Good day. Today is Tuesday, 25th March 2025, and well, the news in the United States and in much of the West today is dominated by the story of a leak of a confidential discussion at the highest levels of the US government immediately prior to the decision to launch air and missile strikes on the Houthis in Yemen. The discussion apparently was held on Signal, a messaging app, one which, by the way, and for the record, I myself have never used. It is a commercial messaging app, and I know several people who do use it, just to say. Seems remarkable that senior US officials would be using an app like that. And one of the people who was linked into the discussion was Mr. Goldberg, who is the chief editor of The Atlantic, a magazine with, I think it's fair to say, a liberal, anti-Trump perspective on things, one which tends to support neocon, or at least neocon positions, though perhaps it would be a stretch to call The Atlantic a straightforwardly neocon magazine. But having said that, that is certainly close to being what it is, and a magazine which I remember I remember because it hosted back in 2016 Barack Obama's long valedictory interview, the last important interview he gave as President of the United States before he left office. So one would like to assume that Mr. Goldberg was not included in this chat intentionally. And of course, as soon as he heard, or rather read, all the things that appeared on the chat, he published a long piece in The Atlantic, which I've read, in which he discusses some of the things that were said by the participants, though he has not obviously discussed classified things about the strikes themselves. Now, I'm going to say the leak itself doesn't, it seems to me, disclose very much. It's clear that the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, was not keen on the strikes against Yemen, against the Houthis. He has been consistently the strongest skeptic about military action altogether. It's fairly well known that he is skeptical about a conflict with Iran. It seems that he was skeptical about a conflict with Yemen, and he is amongst the strongest skeptics of US support for Ukraine in its ongoing conflict with Russia. So we don't learn a huge amount about Vance's stance. He also questioned why the United States should be attacking the Houthis to open the Red Sea to commercial shipping, given that only 3% of commercial shipping heading for the United States passes through the Red Sea, whereas 40% of commercial shipping going to Europe passes through the Red Sea and ultimately the Suez Canal. And Vance says, why is the United States again pulling Europe's coals out of the fire? Isn't this something that the Europeans ought to be attending to rather than asking the United States to become involved? He questions whether the American people, or perhaps more precisely and accurately, Donald Trump's electorate, will take kindly to being propelled into what I suspect Vance quietly worries might be another forever war for Europe's commercial benefit. And, well, those are all the things that Vance said over the course of the discussion. But as far as I am concerned, none of this tells me things about Vance which I didn't already know, that he's a skeptic of the forever wars, of all of these American interventions, has long been clear to me. It's clear also, by the way, that he is an incisive and intelligent man. That came across also as a result of this discussion. And importantly, it was also clear to me from reading the text of the Atlantic article, Goldberg's article, that Vance is nonetheless a team player. He will not push his objections to the point where he breaks unity with the other members of the team. He's loyal to the president and to the administration. Well, that's about Vance. Pete Hegseth, who basically has authorized this attack on the Houthis, he's after all the defense secretary, it turns out shares some of Vance's feelings about the Europeans as well. So some things perhaps have become clearer. It is interesting to learn that officials like Vance and Hegseth are saying the same thing in private to each other that they are saying in public, such as what Vance said, for example, when he came to Munich a few weeks ago to attend the Munich Security Conference, and what Hegseth also said just before when he attended the Ramstein meeting and made various observations about American policy with respect to Ukraine and Europe as well. It's clear that Vance and Hegseth are saying the same things, as I said, in private, that they're saying in public. There is no ambiguity about this. But again, nothing here that was at all new to me. The most intriguing thing about this whole affair is how it came about. First of all, it does seem extraordinary that these communications, as I said, should go through Signal. Now, just for the record, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, I received information, I'm not going to say more than that, about the various steps the Kremlin takes to keep its internal discussions secret. And I'm not going to discuss in this program anything that I learned from this information, some of which was actually quite interesting. All I would say is that anybody reviewing this information, and by the way, I can't vouch as to its total accuracy. I'm not sure how this information was obtained. But all I would say is that it did give a very, very comprehensive account of the level to which the Kremlin goes to make sure that its internal discussions are indeed kept secret. Certainly nothing like using a commercial messaging service or app in the way that appears to have been done here. Nothing like that. And it does seem remarkable that the US government should do this also. And, well, I wonder whether the clue here is in the fact that Mr. Goldberg was linked into the discussions. Could it be, and I am now thinking aloud, I'm guessing, I don't know, but could it be that the fact that he was joined to the discussion was not quite the mistake or error or negligence that we've been told? Could it be that Mr. Goldberg has been the recipient of leaks, just say? Or maybe other journalists have been, and that the decision to use Signal was taken by someone who is behind all those sort of leaks and doesn't want to use more confidential systems, because doing so might compromise security, national security, and might be straightforwardly illegal. Just saying. Or maybe it was all just a mistake. And of course there are people who are saying that a lot of this was illegal anyway. I don't know. But anyway, it's all very intriguing and all very interesting. And there's been fingers pointed at Mike Waltz, Donald Trump's national security advisor. There's speculation that Mr. Waltz might be sacked. It looks to me at the moment that that is unlikely. Mike Johnson, who is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, has come out in his defense. The President, Donald Trump, has downplayed this incident, as has Elon Musk in a rather sarcastic message post on X, where he said that the one way to bury information is to publish it in the Atlantic, because one can be certain in that case that no one will read it. All very droll. But anyway, I'm not going to spend more time discussing this incident. It's attracting a lot of attention. The Democrats are jumping on it. It's all over the European media. I'm not going to say more about it. All I will say is that it has come at an interesting moment, just as the discussions between the Americans and the Russians in Riyadh came to an end. An interesting moment, though I want to stress, I don't actually think that there is any connection between the two things. I don't think that this incident in Washington, this leak of information in Washington, was actually intended to disrupt information about what happened in Riyadh. So now let's turn to what actually did happen in Riyadh. There was a 12-hour meeting, 12 and a half hours meeting between the Americans and the Russians, between the American and Russian teams. Now, that compares with the 40 minutes with which the Americans met the Ukrainians on Sunday, the day before, and the 30 minutes that the Americans apparently gave to the Ukrainians after the meeting with the Russians. We can see that just as Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov, told us, this is a direct negotiation, a bilateral negotiation between the Americans and the Russians, and the Ukrainians are simply being kept informed by the Americans of what they and the Russians are talking about. The Ukrainians are not in any meaningful way participating in the talks. Now, yesterday, there was some talk that the Russians and the Americans were going to release a joint statement today, setting out, giving a summary of what had been discussed and giving a general view of how the negotiations were going or had gone. But today came and no such statement as of now has appeared, and there's some reason to think that perhaps we won't actually see a statement. Now, a Russian official, Vladimir Chizov, who is first deputy chair of the Federation Council Committee on Defense and Security, has said that the reason no joint statement appeared was because the Ukrainians objected to the contents of the draft. Now that's Chizov. He is obviously not a direct participant in the negotiations, but he is a senior Russian official. One of the negotiators, Grigory Karasin, is the chair of the Federation Council's Committee on International Relations. Chizhov is first deputy chair of the Committee on Defense and Security, but presumably they do know each other, Karasin and Chizhov, and it's reasonable to guess that Chizhov has been briefed, and what he's telling us that it was the Ukrainians who are unhappy with some of the contents of the draft joint statement. It's reasonable to guess that this is true. However, again, we have no confirmation of this. Now, we have, however, had quite a lot of information from the Russians as to the course of the negotiations, about what the two sides discussed. But before I touch on that, I do want to touch on a report that is being widely circulated in the media, including in the media in Britain. I read about it in the Daily Telegraph specifically, that over the course of the meeting in Riyadh, the Russian team led by Karasin and Besieda told the Americans in unequivocal terms that the Russian position is that the entirety of the four regions, every single millimeter that makes up the four regions, must be transferred to Russia as part of any settlement of the conflict. Now, I happen to believe that that is the Russian position. That is what Kommersant essentially told us about Putin's meeting with the industrialists last week, just before he spoke to Donald Trump. That is what the regional media is saying. That is what many other Russian officials, including, by the way, Putin himself in the past, and Sergei Lavrov, have said. But this latest story that Karasin and Besieda said this to the Americans over the course of the meeting in Riyadh, about that, I have to say I am much, much more skeptical. I say this because this story appears to originate in a story that has appeared in a newspaper, or to be more precise, a website called Moscow Times. Now, Moscow Times is slightly misleading because it's not actually published in Moscow. It used to be, and indeed it circulated quite widely in Moscow, as I well remember, for quite a long time, and it became a media outlet that many people, many visitors to Moscow used to read, and which I know was widely read by people in the journalist and media community in Moscow, and within the various diplomatic establishments, the embassies there. But it has always been foreign owned. Since 2022, it is no longer published in Russia at all. It is actually published in Amsterdam. In 2023, the Russian government classified it a foreign agent, and in, I believe, August 2024, last year in other words, the Procurator General of the Russian Federation, Russia's most senior law enforcement officer, declared it to be a undesirable organization, which, as I understand it, can make it a criminal offense for people in Russia to interact with it, to have dealings with it. So immediately one comes up against the question of how well informed Moscow Times really is about anything that actually goes on in Moscow, and specifically within the Russian government. And as I said a short time ago, unlike the American government, which leaks like a sieve, apparently, links journalists like Mr. Goldberg to private discussions about airstrikes, and which uses commercial messaging systems like Signal, the Russian government, the Kremlin, as I happen to know, takes elaborate steps to ensure the security of its internal discussions, and basically does take a very, very hard line indeed on unauthorized leaks. Well, I'm just going to say this. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I did read the article in the Moscow Times about this whole story. It's published by a journalist called Pyotr Kozlov, and it says that what the Kremlin wants in new talks with the US on Ukraine, and basically it says that the Russians are going to drag out the negotiations. For the Kremlin, dragging out peace negotiations for as long as possible is imperative for seizing as much Ukrainian territory as it can and getting an upper hand over Kiev in relations with the United States, as Moscow isn't capable of making these battlefield advances quickly. 4 sources familiar with the Kremlin's thinking told the Moscow Times. All of these sources spoke on condition of anonymity in order to share details about sensitive diplomatic matters. So 4 sources familiar with the Kremlin's thinking tells us that these are not sources within the Kremlin, just say, and they might not even be Russian. Then we go on to read that time is currently on our side and will try to make the most of it. A Russian diplomat told the Moscow Times. So now we have information that one of these 4 sources is a Russian diplomat, and then we're told that the Russians will insist on their maximalist demands before they agree to lay down arms, and ideally the Kremlin hopes that Washington will either tacitly allow Russia to keep advancing on the battlefield whilst diplomats negotiate, or even pressure Kiev to fully withdraw its troops from Russian-occupied regions, including Kherson and Zaporozhye, said a current Russian official. Official may mean that this person is also a diplomat, and I wonder whether it's the same diplomat as we heard about before. And then we're told that Moscow claims that the Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye and Kherson regions are Russian territory despite not fully controlling any of them. Moscow is bent on solidifying control over these regions at any cost, as Putin cannot politically afford to abandon them after enshrining their status in the constitution. A Kremlin-linked official said. Now that, for me, is a particular alarm bell, because a Kremlin-linked official obviously does not mean an official of the Kremlin. It means someone who the Moscow Times considers to be an official. It could be somebody working for the Russian government, but it is not somebody who is within the Kremlin and who is therefore actually at all well informed about the Kremlin's thinking. And then we read this: there is no constitutional mechanism for regions to secede. We need all of Zaporozhye and Kherson. Either Trump influences them to leave, or we are told, enter into long negotiations and simply use military force to establish control. That's the worst option for us, because river crossings are always painful operations. Would a Russian official, a high-ranking Russian official, actually disclose that kind of information to an organization like Moscow Times, which the Procurator General's office has said is an undesirable organisation, one for which there might be legal penalties speaking to. And then this same official, I presume it is the same official, goes on to say that crossing the Dnieper River and capturing Dnipro and Kherson would be an enormously challenging operation. The Russian army, all that it can realistically achieve is the capture of Slavyansk and Dnipropetrovsk areas. Physically, we can't, this force, that's to say the Russian army, can't go anywhere further or do anything more. Reaching Odessa is, of course, impossible, and we don't even need that. As I said, would a Russian official, an actual senior Russian official, really disclose to Moscow Times information like that? I don't know. I would have thought it extremely unlikely. My guess is that Moscow Times, Mr. Kozlov, has spoken to someone from one of the embassies, maybe the Russian embassy in the Netherlands, just guessing, or maybe a press officer. I doubt that we're getting here any actual information from within the Kremlin itself. So, I've digressed a little. I don't take this particular story at all seriously. If you read it in the media anywhere, my view is that yes, the Russians do want all of the 4 regions transferred to them, and that this will indeed be a sticking point in the negotiations. But don't believe it because Moscow Times is telling you. Believe it because Putin and Lavrov have said it. Putin, in Putin's case, most recently, when he met with the industrialists a couple of days ago, a week ago. So anyway, let's move on and discuss what the Russians and the Americans actually said to each other. And the best place to start, it seems to me, is with Karasin, the head of the Russian mission, the lead negotiator. And we actually have a fairly lengthy dispatch from Russia's official news agency, TASS, which tells us what Karasin said. The meeting held between the Russian and US teams of experts in the Saudi capital on Monday was complex but useful for the 2 countries as they managed to discuss multiple issues. Grigory Karasin, chairman of the Federation Council Committee on International Affairs, who took part in the negotiations, told TASS. We discussed everything, and the dialogue was detailed and complex, but quite useful for us and for the Americans. We discussed numerous issues, and we are then told that there was a 12-hour meeting, and that prior to the talks, Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov had said the 2 sides would discuss reviving the Black Sea Grain Initiative as a follow-up after a recent phone call between Russian President Putin and his US counterpart Donald Trump. So that's Karasin. It was a complex discussion. They covered all the topics, probably including the territorial questions, Ukraine's membership of NATO, enforcement of ceasefires, lots of those things. That explains perhaps why the discussion went on for 12.5 hours. But there's every reason to think that the major focus was the revival of the grain deal. And here we have further information, and this has now been provided by no less a person than Russia's Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. And Lavrov has now given an interview to Channel 1, which is Russia's most important, its premium channel. and he said, we support the return of the Black Sea Initiative in some form better suited to us, and that this was the issue which was discussed at the talks in Riyadh as a priority. Our position is simple. We cannot take Zelenskyy at his word. The market for grain and the market of fertilizers should be predictable, and no one should attempt to exclude Russia from those markets. Moscow is worried about the situation with food in Africa and other countries of the global south that have been affected by the West's games. That was what Lavrov said. And we read elsewhere that the Russians did indeed discuss the grain talks, and according to Lavrov, our negotiators appointed by President Putin asked their American counterparts to keep all of these issues in mind. Given Ukraine's track record and the entire Black Sea gas saga, we expect there to be no ambiguity this time. And then TASS goes on to set out what all of the various problems were with the previous grain deal, the one that was negotiated in 2022. It says the Black Sea Initiative, also known as the grain deal, allowed the supply of Ukrainian grain from Black Sea ports and ensured the normalization of exports of Russian agricultural products and fertilizers to global markets. Despite the agreements, the West redirected the bulk of Ukrainian grain to its own countries, with the key target of the deal to supply grain to countries in need never met. Obligations to Russia were not fulfilled, which is why Moscow withdrew from the deal in July 2023. And it was not just about the fact that Russia was not able to continue export of grain and fertilizer through European ports, and without export sanctions restrictions. It was also, and I clearly remember this, that ships, according to the Russians, sending grain to Odessa, some of them, according to the Russians, carried weapons in violation of the terms of the grain deal. The inspection regime supposedly being carried out by Turkey never worked, and for all of these reasons, in July 2023, the Russians decided to pull out of the grain deal. So what Lavrov is saying, yes, let's go back when we have no objection to the grain deal, but we need to have all of the problems which caused the original grain deal to fail. We need those to be fully sorted out. We need to have the Europeans fulfill their obligations to lift sanctions on our food and fertilizer exports, and by the way, those of Belarus as well. And secondly, we need a proper regime of inspections on Ukrainian ships. And I can very well imagine that talking all this through, and these are not by any means straightforward issues, could have taken 12.5 hours. And I can very well imagine that, given that this is the Russian stance, the Ukrainians might have balked at some of what the Russians were proposing, and that might have caused the Ukrainians, as Chizhikov says, to object to the publication by the Americans and the Russians of a joint statement. Now, I think there's a number of things to say here. It is now, I think, absolutely clear that this negotiation to resolve the conflict, to get us to a ceasefire, is going to take a long time. The Moscow Times article that I've just talked about, basically what it's trying to imply is that the Russians are stringing out the negotiations. I don't think this is strictly true. I think what the Russians are trying to do is to try to hammer out the negotiations so, as Lavrov says, to nail the Ukrainians down. They've been tricked, as they see it, many times by the Ukrainians before. They want the Americans to make cast iron commitments, or make commitments anyway, that the Ukrainians would have difficulty wriggling out from, and they want therefore a detailed discussion looking at every aspect of the problem with clear understandings and commitments by each side, ultimately with the United States ultimately taking responsibility for enforcement. But what that means is that we're going to have probably several days, maybe weeks of discussions about the grain deal, weeks of discussions about the ongoing ceasefire on the energy systems, which, remember, is only in place for 30 days. And, of course, when the negotiations begin on the actual peace agreement between Russia and Ukraine, those negotiations are going to be tough and complex as well. If negotiations on the grain deal are tough and complex, we can be certain that all of the negotiations are going to be. And this is not surprising. I understand that many people want to see this all over as quickly as possible. Many people would like to see a ceasefire by late April. Donald Trump clearly, for whatever reason, wants to see a ceasefire as soon as possible, perhaps by late April. But if this conflict is going to be settled through negotiations, it simply isn't practical to imagine that these negotiations can be sorted out and sorted through in the few weeks that many people would want them to be. We are looking at, my guess is, several months of negotiations. Perhaps, if we're fortunate, we might have a ceasefire by late summer, early autumn. And hopefully, if everything goes well, and it might not go well, we could possibly have a final agreement in place by the end of the year. And that's if everybody gives this everything they have and works purposefully to that objective. Now, I've, before doing this program, familiarized myself with the negotiations which I think correspond most closely to these negotiations which are underway now. And those are the negotiations, the Paris negotiations, that eventually made it possible for the United States to extricate itself from the conflict in Vietnam. Now, those negotiations began in 1968. President Johnson, President Johnson, there's some dispute as to exactly why he took the decision to initiate the negotiations. Some say it was because of the success of the anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy in the New Hampshire primary. Others, and I'm amongst those, think it was because of growing pressures within the administration itself and a shift in elite opinion in Washington. Anyway, whatever his reasons, Johnson decided in the spring of 1968 that negotiations find a way to get the United States out of the Vietnam War should begin. And those negotiations did indeed begin in the spring and summer of 1968. And there were lots of problems because, of course, the US and North Vietnam were negotiating with each other. The North Vietnamese wanted the Viet Cong, the communist insurgency in South Vietnam, to participate in the negotiations. The Americans and the South Vietnamese objected. The Americans wanted South Vietnam to participate in the negotiations. And the North Vietnamese objected because they disputed the legitimacy of the government of South Vietnam. And there were arguments and quarrels about this, and eventually a compromise was found whereby the negotiations would be purely between the United States and North Vietnam, but with the South Vietnamese participating as part of the American delegation and the Viet Cong participating as part of the North Vietnamese delegation. And then there were arguments about the shape of the table around which the discussions should take place. And then there were all kinds of compromises about that. And then after all of these issues were resolved, the negotiations ground on. And, well, the first major breakthrough came, as I've read, in 1972, when President Nixon agreed to the North Vietnamese demand that the American troops could start to withdraw from South Vietnam without North Vietnam committing in return to an immediate ceasefire. And then there were still difficult negotiations which ground on through the rest of 1972 until eventually, after many bumps and arguments, a final agreement was signed in January 1973. And throughout this period, South Vietnam, the government of South Vietnam, President Thie's government, was extremely hostile and negative about the whole process and was obstructing the negotiations in every possible way that it could, until eventually, in order to break through that logjam, Nixon's national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, began secret talks with a senior North Vietnamese official, Le Duc Tho, and Kissinger and Le Duc Tho eventually came to the agreement directly, in direct talks between themselves, cutting the South Vietnamese out completely, and in the autumn of 1972, presenting the South Vietnamese with the terms. And Thieu was very unhappy, and he complained about it bitterly, and nonetheless, he was eventually basically strong-armed into accepting what the Americans and the North Vietnamese had agreed with each other. And, well, that gives one a sense of how complex negotiations like this can be and how long they can take. This is 4 years, 4 continuous years of difficult negotiations, despite the fact that the United States had already made the political decision by the time the negotiations began that it would pull out of Vietnam. Now, why assume that negotiations to end the conflict in Ukraine are going to be easier? Just saying, many of the same difficulties remain in place. There's arguments about the ceasefire. The Russians have raised all kinds of issues about the ceasefire, just as they're raising all kinds of issues about the grain deal. These are not, in my opinion, devices to string out the negotiations. They are issues which the Russians consider very important because they don't trust the Ukrainians to adhere to their part of any agreements. The Russians are saying this quite openly, and we will see in a moment that they have grounds to say this. They have grounds now to say this. And yes, just as the United States in the 1970s was keen to extricate itself from the conflict in Vietnam, one gets the sense that President Trump and his officials, and I suspect a significant number of people within the leadership of the United States, want to extricate the United States from the conflict in Ukraine. But they have the same problems, just as the North Vietnamese in the 1970s wouldn't be hurried, so the Russians today won't be hurried. And in Zelenskyy and the Ukrainians, the Americans have a perhaps even more obstructive and difficult negotiating partner than they did in President Thieu and the South Vietnamese in the 1970s. So the fact that there's been no joint statement as a result of the discussions which took place between the Americans and the Russians yesterday, the fact that these discussions have not produced an outcome, the fact that we might not get a ceasefire for several weeks, maybe in April. The Americans are talking about apparently a ceasefire by the 20th of April. It may take significantly longer than that. None of that is a reason to assume that this process is going to fail, or that there won't be some kind of a ceasefire and a negotiation and a final settlement eventually. Now, when one is confronted with all of this, always the view that then is expressed is that the eventual deal that is going to be done is one that the Ukrainians are not going to honor, and that the Russians are going to be tricked, and that the Ukrainians therefore are going to come out the winners from the process. Well, if the eventual deal essentially cuts off the supply of weapons and intelligence to Ukraine, then I would argue it's absolutely the other way. That is what happened in terms of South Vietnam. South Vietnam found that after the Americans had extricated themselves from the conflict, after the deal was done in January 1973, the Americans were no longer willing to go on providing Ukraine with military and intelligence aid. And the result was that though it took a further 2 years after the January 1973 agreement, the conflict eventually restarted, and in the end, South Vietnam collapsed. And, well, for the North Vietnamese, getting the Americans to leave, getting the Americans to decide that they were not going to provide continued military aid to South Vietnam was absolutely critical to achieving that outcome. Now, I'm not saying if there is a deal between the Americans and the Russians over Ukraine that the outcome is going to be the same. But it seems to me much more likely that it will be the same, that after such a deal, after all that has happened, it will be the United States which will be more anxious not to become further enmeshed in this conflict. And therefore, going forward it will be the Russians who will capitalize from any agreement that is eventually made. However, we don't yet know, and as I said, it could take several weeks and months before the deal is eventually agreed. What I will say is that though I do think this process could take a long, long time, firstly, without any guarantee of a successful outcome, again, with a conflict of this kind, with an individual like Zelenskyy involved, there can be no such guarantee. I still think that it will not take, the process will not be as protracted as it was over the conflict in Vietnam. For one overwhelmingly simple reason, which is that this time the US Army is not publicly and visibly engaged with hundreds of thousands of men deployed to the theatre, as was the case in the conflict in Vietnam. And I think that will make it easier for the negotiations to move forward. And by the way, I also think it will make it much easier for the United States to make the kind of concessions it will need to make in order to make the negotiations succeed. So anyway, there we are. That's what I wanted to say about the outcome of the meeting yesterday. It is clear that there have been no agreements. We are very far still from agreements about the grain deal. The fact that Chizhikov is saying that the Ukrainians objected to the draft statement the Americans and the Russians had prepared with each other suggests that the Americans and the Russians did come to some kind of consensus on some of the points, but that the Ukrainians were very unhappy. The Ukrainians must also be asking themselves whether sending their defense minister with so many of Zelenskyy's own personal aides, with military officials to Riyadh to meet with the Americans, whether sending such a high-profile delegation to Riyadh only to have discussions with the Americans that lasted in total around 1 hour and 10 minutes, as opposed to the 12 and a half hours that the Americans and the Russians spoke with each other, whether that entire exercise in the end was worthwhile. Probably Zelenskyy doesn't see it that way. He's had another bizarre interview with Simon Schuster, which I'm not going to speak about. I'm surprised, by the way, he's even talking to Simon Schuster after this extraordinary article that Simon Schuster published about him just over a year ago. But anyway, in it, Zelenskyy posed in front of some absolutely bizarre paintings, which he has in the building close to which houses his office, one which shows the Kremlin on fire. I'm not sure what message Zelenskyy thinks he is conveying by having that painting there, but certainly it does not convey to me a painting of a man who is seriously interested in achieving peace. Now, that now brings me to Russian concerns about Ukrainian compliance with ceasefire deals. The Russian Defense Ministry yesterday talked about Ukrainian attacks on Russian energy facilities in violation of the 30-day truce. It gives a list of the facilities that were attacked: the Kropotkinskaya pumping station of the Caspian Pipeline Consortium in Krasnodar region, another facility that was also attacked on the Kavkazskaya Stanitsa. I'm not quite sure what that is, but it's clearly a energy facility. They say yet another facility was attacked on the 23rd of March, and that was the Glabovsky gas condensate field located in the Tarkhankut Peninsula of Crimea, which supplies Russian citizens and economy in this area with gas. And the Valuki gas metering plant in Belgorod region, that was attacked on the 22nd of March. And anyway, it gives a whole list of Russian energy facilities that the Ukrainians have attacked since the commencement, the presumed commencement of the 30-day truce. And the Russian Defense Ministry, in its statement yesterday, then went on to say this: thus, despite the statements made by Zelenskyy, including those announced to American partners, the Kiev regime continues to attack the energy infrastructure, including the international one, on the territory of the Russian Federation. All of this proves once again that it is impossible to come to an agreement with Kiev. Now, that was yesterday, but today the Russian Defense Ministry is saying that there have been more attacks on the Russian energy system, and they've issued another statement. Amid the expert-level talks between Russia and the United States held in Riyadh on 24th March, the Kiev regime continued to deliberately launch strikes using drones against Russian peaceful energy infrastructure. As a result of an attack on 24th March by a Ukrainian drone targeting infrastructure of the Rosseti-Kuban-Krasnodar region, the 500 kV Rostov NPP Tikhoretsk number 2 high voltage line was shot down. This is an attack, in other words, of a voltage line of the Russian nuclear power plant in Rostov. With quick and competent action, the personnel managed to curb the emergency and avoid any negative consequences for consumers. In the Lugansk People's Republic, Ukrainian drones attacked the Svatovo gas distribution station of the Lugansk gas service. To quickly say, the Ukrainians may argue that attacks on energy facilities in Crimea and in Donbass, which of course they consider Ukrainian, are not covered by this ceasefire. Anyway, that's what they might say. I'm not here to comment on that. And then the Russian Defense Ministry then went on to say that on 24th in the evening, 24th March, another Ukrainian drone was shot down over Crimea, which was targeting the ground equipment of the Glebovskoye underground gas distribution facility. And then the Russian Defense Ministry goes on to say this: ongoing daily attacks on the Russian energy infrastructure once again confirm that Zelenskyy is unable to come to an agreement with and that he is beyond the control of those external guarantors ensuring compliance with any possible agreements. Now, Peskov, Putin's spokesman, then issued a further comment saying that despite these Ukrainian attacks and despite these statements from the Russian Defense Ministry, the Russians for the moment will continue to honor their side of the ceasefire. It is, after all, only for 30 days. What the Russians are doing here is that they're building up a list of Ukrainian ceasefire violations. And they will be handing them to Trump and to the Americans, and they will be saying to Trump and the Americans, look, you want us to agree a wider ceasefire, You want us to come to all kinds of compromises with the Ukrainians, but you can see for yourself, Ukraine never honors its obligations. The only way it can be made to do so is by intrusive and exhaustive inspections, and we, that is to say Russia, must have a role in these inspections, because otherwise no ceasefire is going to work. Now, the Americans under Biden would have rejected any proposal like that, any comment, any suggestion of that kind, outright. This time, with Trump and his team apparently looking to extricate the United States from the conflict in Ukraine, they might be prepared to look into that. In which case, the Ukrainians will, of course, become even more concerned, and we could see further Ukrainian attempts to object to the publication of joint statements and to things of that kind. Anyway, we're involved. We're looking forward here now to a very complex, very difficult negotiation. The Russians clearly believe that they have the advantage, which, by the way, they do. I'll come to the military situation in a moment. The Russians are able to take time over this. They will want to take time over this. They know that the Americans don't really have much leverage over them. They know that in the summer, the weapons authorized by Congress last year will have run their course, that in order to supply more weapons, Trump must make a further, must exercise his drawdown authority further, and eventually, sooner or later, he's going to have to go to Congress again, something which politically he will probably not want to do. And the Russians also know that for whatever reason, Trump seems very, very keen on a peace agreement. And if the Russians are bringing up all of these points, if they're pointing out to Trump that it's ultimately the non-compliance of Zelenskyy himself, whom, of course, Trump has now met, and with whom Trump had that argument in the Oval Office, well, the Russians will be able to say, look, the problem is not with us, it is with your erstwhile ally. If you can't control him, which it seems you can't, then if you really want to move forward with us, why are you continuing to waste your time with him? Why don't you just simply cut him off, as arguably you should have done, and then previously, in which case you and I can move forward together. You and we can move forward together on all of the very many important issues that concern both of us. Now, on that issue, there's been a very interesting article in the New York Times, which essentially makes that very point, which is that for the Russians, engaging with the United States, having discussions with the United States on multiple different issues is good and useful in itself. They can move forward their agenda towards US-Russia normalization. And they will be telling the Americans, and I'm sure that we'll be hearing more and more about this as we move forward, that it makes absolutely no sense to hold this entire process of normalization hostage to resolution of an intractable conflict in which the Ukrainians show such unwillingness to be cooperative. And again, I can't help but think that the United States will eventually come round to this. The United States does need to speak to the Russians. It's got a massive crisis brewing in the Middle East. It's worried about all kinds of things in all sorts of places around the world, provided negotiations between the Americans and the Russians continue. That gives Trump enough political space, I would have thought, to work with the Russians on other things, such as, for example, the stabilization of the global oil market, which is important for the economic health of the United States and to bring down worldwide inflation, to get the Russians help with the situation in the Middle East, specifically with Iran, but perhaps also with other matters as well. Normalization of relations between the United States and Russia is a useful goal, an important goal in itself, separate from the question of Ukraine. And I think myself that this is probably where we're heading. There'll be negotiations. The Americans and the Russians will continue speaking. At some point, there might even be a summit meeting between Putin and Trump, though Peskov today was careful to say that there are no plans or discussions at the moment underway to set up that meeting. So the Americans and the Russians can move forward with all sorts of things together. They can have their experts, Karasin and Anton, continuing to meet and talk things over in Riyadh or wherever about Ukraine. They can have the Ukrainians hanging around and worrying about what that all means. They can present the Ukrainians with all sorts of ideas which the Ukrainians might reject, damaging their relations with the Americans long term. But there is no logical reason why the improvement in US-Russia relations should be linked to the ending of the conflict in Ukraine. After all, as the Russians can also point out to the Americans, as indeed they will point out to the Americans, it is American actions that have hurt Russia, not Russian actions which have hurt America. It is American missiles that have been fired into Russia. It is Russian soldiers who have been killed by American weapons. It is the Americans who have prolonged the war in Ukraine by supporting Zelenskyy and his regime in Kiev. It's the Americans, in other words, who have been doing the damage to the Russians, not the Russians who have been doing the damage to the Americans. And if the Russians nonetheless are prepared to improve relations with the United States, why should the United States not agree? Anyway, let's move on and discuss the military situation. And I'm not going to discuss this in a huge amount of detail. Group of Forces North continue to say that there's a significant Ukrainian force trapped in the village of Guyevo in southern Kursk, that fighting in southern Kursk region continues, though in several places now the Russians have reached the border between Kursk and Sumy region and have regained control of the old state border. Of course, the Russians are also present in Sumy region itself. And there were reports about a day ago that the Russians have in fact expanded the territory that they control in Sumy region. Now, the Ukrainians, for their part, still apparently refuse to allow their soldiers in Guyevo to surrender. There's been many reports that large numbers of Ukrainian troops have indeed been taken prisoner already in Kursk region, but we've not yet seen an entire military unit capitulate in the way that we saw with the Azov Brigade in Mariupol back in 2022. So there's still quite a long way, well, at least there's some way to go there. Even as the fighting in Kursk continues and gets ever closer to its conclusion, the Ukrainians have been expending a significant amount of time, equipment, and men trying to break into Belgorod region. And there's been various claims by the Ukrainians at various times that they've either entered or captured the village of Demidovo in Belgorod region. A group of forces north has denied this. Redovka, the Russian newspaper, which I believe has journalists on the ground, has denied this as well. And I think that it is almost certainly untrue. As I've said many times now, these attacks on Belgorod region, I don't think have any great strategic military rationale behind them. Rather, they are an operation conducted to preserve Zelenskyy's reputation and prestige. The attempt to capture Russian territory in Kursk has been a complete disaster, has ended in total disaster, and so Zelenskyy wants to capture at least some places in Belgorod region so that he can tell the world and his people, well, despite what happened in Kursk, the reality is we still control ground inside Russia. I think myself that that is all there is to it. Now, elsewhere, there were more reports yesterday from senior Russian officials about the situation in Chasiv Yar. The Russians seem to be increasingly confident that this battle for Chasiv Yar is indeed about to end. And there was one Russian official, I forget which one, who actually said that he believes that once Chasiv Yar is captured, the battle for Donbass will essentially be over. With the Russians in control of Toretsk, it will be impossible for the Ukrainians to mount a prolonged defense of Konstantinovka. If Konstantinovka falls, then the Russians are at the gates of Kramatorsk, and the entire Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation begins, its entire position begins to look precarious. Now, there were some reports a couple of days ago that the Russians on the Zherebets River have pushed further south and have captured, or at least, or perhaps entered, I don't know that they've captured, that they've entered a village called Yampol, which is located to the west of Siversk. And various Russian officials are also saying that the Russians have made further progress towards Liman, though as is often the way with Russian reports, they're very vague as to exactly what it is they mean. But anyway, the point is that if this is all true, then we can see that the Russians probably are now closing the net around Siversk. And of course, if Ukrainian defenses in Siversk collapse, and if Chasiv Yar is captured, actually, I should correct that, when Chasiv Yar is captured, and if and when the Russians collapse and capture Liman and, as I said, Siversk as well, then of course the entire military position in northern Donbass will shift, and Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the conurbation there, the position there will look very precarious. Now, there's been a number of claims that the Russians find it very difficult to capture cities. I would point out that over the course of this war, the Russians have captured Mariupol, a city which at its peak had a population of more than 500,000 people, quite a big place, and that the Russians also captured the Severodonetsk and Lysychansk conurbation, and, well, they've captured other places too. One must not make the mistake of thinking that some of these locations, bigger cities like Zaporozhye, for example, are beyond the capacity of the Russian army to capture because of their size. Zaporozhye is bigger than Mariupol, but the two cities are of the same order of magnitude overall. Places like Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Krasnogorovka, and others proved very difficult for the Russians to capture because they had been heavily fortified over many years. Zaporozhye is not in that position. And I would add that for the Ukrainians to be thrown back and to have to defend a place like Zaporozhye would certainly, I think, cause a collapse or at least a crisis in their morale. Loss of a city like that would be absolutely devastating, and one wonders how the Ukrainians would feel if they were actually put in the position of having to defend it. Meanwhile, last night the Russians did conduct another massive missile and drone strike across Ukraine, apparently not targeting energy systems, just saying. But anyway, an attack of that kind did take place, and no doubt the pace of these attacks will continue. They appear to happen pretty much every night now. That they become routine shouldn't make one disregard the fact that they are now a continuous matter. Ukrainian attacks across Russia, by contrast, are much more sporadic. Anyway, or periodic if you prefer. Now, coming back to my further point, we are in March. It's still the time of the Rasputitsa, the spring thaw. Quite likely, in a few weeks' time, when the ground starts to harden, operations will begin in earnest. There are some claims that Zelenskyy and Syrskyi are thinking up a new offensive for April. Given the state of the Ukrainian army, as even the Ukrainians themselves acknowledge, and given the fact that there is an end point to the American equipment that Ukraine has, I have to say that this offensive, if it comes, seems to me like a disastrous idea. And I wonder whether all the talk about an offensive is actually, the Ukrainian offensive, this time really is a bluff. About a Russian offensive, on the contrary, I not only think that is coming, but I'm getting all sorts of reports that people within the Russian military are complaining that it wasn't launched sooner. Anyway, we shall see. I'm guessing that by late April, May, things will start to heat up again, in which case we will probably have intense fighting and perhaps quite a lot of movement all the way up to October. Now, even as all of this is going on, the Europeans have been talking about rearmament, and there is an absolutely devastating article about the rearmament plans in the Daily Telegraph. And this has come from Ambrose Evans Pritchard, a journalist who just a short time ago was telling us about how Europe looked likely to become again the great military superpower, taking on the Russians and equalizing the Americans. In this article, he acknowledges, and I will give this to him, he acknowledges how fundamentally wrong about that he was. And give the man credit, it's only taken him a short time to see that. And as we will see, he admits this fully himself. He admits his error himself, which is an unusual thing for journalists to do. Anyway, he says this: Europe's half-baked rearmament boom is already turning into a fiasco. Record debt and hard-nosed protectionism are derailing plans to counter Putin. And then he goes on to say this: never underestimate Europe's capacity to disappoint. Rearmament euphoria and the explosive catch-up rally in European industrial stocks over the last month have run ahead of hard fiscal facts. Italy and Spain do not have credible plans to ramp up defence spending, and nor does France when you drill into the details. The Club Med bloc, that's the Mediterranean countries, and Belgium are already in incipient compound interest trap of rising real borrowing costs, as is the United Kingdom. It is simply not possible for us to find another 20 billion euros or 30 billion euros for weapons when we are already making tremendous efforts to cut our debt burden, and we are fundamentally constrained in what we can do for the Italian people, said Italy's finance minister Giancarlo Giorgetti. The military Keynesian boom is chiefly a German story. The 900 billion euro coalition plan, that's German coalition plan. By the way, the new German parliament convened today, and I understand that Chancellor Scholz has finally resigned, so it's likely that we will have Chancellor Merz by this evening, or at the latest by tomorrow. Anyway, the 900 billion euro coalition plan for extra defence and infrastructure spending over 10 years is large. It amounts to 90 billion euros annually, or 2% of German GDP. But keep it in perspective. The Draghi report says the EU as a whole must raise investment by 800 billion euros every year to pull the bloc out of technological decline, coupled with deregulation shock therapy. The more we see of Europe's patchy and fractious rearmament, the less it looks like Chamberlain's Blitz in 1938 or Roosevelt's in 1941. I would add that anybody who thinks that Germany is going to spend 800 billion euros on defence, even over the next $900 billion on defence over the next 10 years, is deluding themselves. Most of this money is going to vanish into all kinds of projects and probably debt repayments and fiscal problems. I've discussed this in previous programs. I'm not going to discuss the follies of Merz's debt explosion here on this program. Anyway, to continue with Ambrose Evans Pritchard, Sven Jaristern from Goldman Sachs has added up the aggregate stimulus for the Eurozone and concluded that it barely moves the needle over the mid-2020s. The net fiscal impulse will still be negative this year and neutral next year. Growth will be just 0.9% in 2025. Goldman Sachs has cut its forecast to 1.3% in 2026 and 1.5% in 2027. There is a further catch. The spike in German bond yields has forced up yields for others, further poisoning Club Med debt dynamics. This effect more than offsets the small tailwinds to growth, and that's from Goldman Sachs. And then there's a great deal more. He says that if there is a trade war, Europe will suffer more than the United States will. And he says that France's Emmanuel Macron talks grandly of EU rearmament, but lacks both the political capital and the fiscal firepower to put his economy in a war footing. France has a structural budget deficit of 5% of GDP. The IMF says public debt in France will hit 112% last year and is heading for 124% by 2029, even before any rise in military spending. Macron aims to boost defense spending by around 0.8% of GDP by 2030, but how will he pay for it on top of all his other nosebleed pledges, AI dominance, a fleet of nuclear reactors, etc., whilst also pledging to ring-fence the French social model? As for the EU's Commission's, in other words, Ursula's $800 billion euro slush fund, this slips through your fingers like fine sand. I should say that Ambrose Evans Pritchard doesn't use the expression slush fund. That's my expression. He calls it by its formal name, Rearm Europe Plan. It is in fact a slush fund. Anyway, as for this slush fund, it slips through your fingers like fine sand. Virtual money, in the words of Italy's Giorgia Meloni, who said it was mad to try to go it alone without the United States. Most of the 800 billion euros is a theoretical figure to come from member states. The hard core is a 150 billion euro lending facility to beef up Europe's arm industry, but this has already run into trouble, starting with Hungary's veto. The Spanish want to use this money for climate change, turning the mechanism into a slush fund. That's Ambrose Evans Pritchard's word this time, not mine. Alex Christoforou also talks about a slush fund. Well, there you go, 150 billion euro slush fund. And Ambrose Evans Pritchard says that makes it like the COVID recovery fund, which ended up being used for every pet scheme except for COVID. And Ambrose then goes on to say, as always, Brussels, Paris and others have an ulterior motive in pushing for joint debt issuance. They seize on every chance to smuggle through fiscal union or to get their hands on the credit cards of the frugals. In other words, he means Germany. He's perhaps been listening to the conversations that Alex Christoforou and I have been having on the Duran, because we've said repeatedly that this is all about setting up such slush funds and getting Eurobonds issued. And then rather optimistically, he says that the Dutch refuse any use of the European rearmament fund for joint lending. The Germans are unlikely to be more sympathetic once Friedrich Merz takes charge. He must bend over backwards to show that last week's changes to the constitutional debt brake do not open the floodgates to fiscal ruin. Having ditched one taboo, the German centre-right is even more reluctant to breach another, said Berenberg Bank. Eurobonds are stone dead. I don't believe that. That's the one part of this article by Ambrose Evans Pritchard which I don't believe. Berenberg is a private bank, by the way, very old and storied history in Germany, deeply conservative, strong believers in sound money. They obviously are dead against Eurobonds or anything like that. But anybody who thinks that Friedrich Merz is in any conceivable sense a fiscal conservative, Mr. BlackRock is any kind of fiscal conservative, is completely deluded. He's going to spend money to the extent that he can, exactly as so-called fiscal conservatives have often done in the United States. And that's going to be the future of Germany and Europe. But anyway, Ambrose then goes on to say the rearmament saga is exposing deep lines of cleavage within the EU, above all between those states still trying to keep the US on board and Europeanists who see it as a chance to break free and to turn Europe into a muscular great power, which is a fantasy. And he then talks about Germany's plan to create a wall around the Slovakian Gap and Narva and all this. But he says that the worst is now happening. The talks are degenerating into a procurement carve-up, with each country hoping to use EU money to push its own weapon systems as a form of industrial and jobs policy. An unpleasant mix of Euro ideology and hard-nosed protectionism means that the UK is being excluded, even though it is an integral part of Europe's military ecosystem and is defending the EU's front line against Russia with troops and is rock solid behind Ukraine. Well, there we go. And he then says that it's doubly surreal because Berlin is angling for British nuclear protection and talks are underway behind the scenes for a joint Anglo-French nuclear deterrent. That isn't going to happen either, just saying. And anyway, he then ends by saying, please forgive my burst of optimism a few weeks ago. I now fear that the EU's incorrigible pathologies will reassert themselves and that Europe's half-baked rearmament will degenerate into a fiasco. I fear too that Europe will abandon brave Ukraine to the wolves, plural. The wolves being presumably Putin and Trump. Well, Ambrose is right. His euphoria of a few weeks ago was utterly misplaced. It's, as I said to his credit, that this time he's come back to earth so fast. What he is laying out is the reality. Even then, he doesn't address the core issue, which is that the industrial base to achieve this great exercise in rearmament simply is not there. Without that industrial base, all of these funds that are being created are inevitably going to end up becoming slush funds because there is nothing else realistically that they can be. Anyway, there it is. I think over the next few weeks, we'll be hearing less from the Europeans. It looks like Starmer's plan to send peacekeepers to Ukraine is dead. It looks as if the rearmament program in Europe, it's now being gradually recognized, is going to lead nowhere. We'll see what Merz manages to do in Germany, but anybody who is objective, I think, must be deeply pessimistic about the prospects there. Meanwhile, the negotiations between the Americans and the Russians will continue. I suspect that gradually, over time, we will see a continued convergence between these two great powers and a warming in relations. And at the same time, the war will grind on. And grind on with the Russians taking more and more territory, getting closer to the Dnieper all the time, putting both the Americans and the Ukrainians into a position where a ceasefire not only benefits them, but where they will have to make concessions over territory, which I suspect at the moment they are unwilling to make. And it could still be the case that there will be no peace. Zelenskyy continues to remain implacably opposed to this. There's talk about replacing Zelenskyy, but I've already said that it looks to me very difficult to see how that can be done. In which case, well, the war will be decided on the battlefield rather than through negotiations. Though, as a global geopolitical conflict, we are probably coming to the point when the war as such has ended. Anyway, that's me for today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Lastly, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.